welcome to Geraumt, your podcast for design, information, and space. Um, Today, again, I have a very interesting talking partner. Um, we're talking about colors today, and I've been on a congress, the Healthcare Design Congress, a couple of months ago, and I heard her presentation. And I think even during the presentation, I wrote her an Instagram message. I would really like to talk to you in our podcast. And happily enough, she will give us some time and talk about colors. It's Helena Howard. She's an architect at Hawkins Brown in London, and she's as well a design tutor and mentoring secondary school students and university students. So she's written in her own biography that's a very inspiring and motivating work. And she tries to basically influence the next generation of architects, which in itself is quite an interesting profession and worth doing a podcast about, to be honest. But today we're going to talk about colors. So, Helena, thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
The first question I really want to ask is if I look at your website, color is a passion of yours. At least it transports this kind of picture to me. So the question would be, how did color become a passion of yours?
I don't know. I think it would be more accurate to say that it never left. I think we're kind of predisposed. We're kind of born with an attraction to color and to be drawn to color. And I think that's evident in the fact that when you look at buildings for children, they're often really brightly colored. You know, primary schools and hospitals for children, absolutely full of color. And then at some point, you know, and I don't necessarily know why, but at some point in our education, we're educated out of loving color, or we're told that it's childish, or it's not sophisticated. And I'm quite kind of fascinated by that, because I find that very strange. And I think you know, particularly when I walk around London and I look at some of the new developments going up, there's a lot of grids made from brown bricks, and I think, why is this? You know, how can we challenge this?
Mhm. There is actually, if we're talking about public space and color, I'm always quite fascinated on how many of, if we talk about corporate architecture of some of the furniture, they're usually not colorful. They're all going into grays and blacks. Uh, of course, it's the landscape around that. If we have a
Mm,
park where they probably can do something with colors,
mm.
but not with the furniture.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think there's people kind of assume that color is difficult, or that it's too
Mhm.
subjective, and that more people will agree to something being a neutral color than something being bright red, because bright red is too controversial, I suppose, or less appealing to the masses.
I think it could actually, if I look at how the big trend of sustainability
Mm,
and greening is kind of influencing our behavior in public space as well. And I've read a couple of articles about how you can make your urban garden to attract more bees, this kind of projects.
mm, mm,
They seem to bring color into the urban landscape. So I really find that very positive, because I can see in each city street that if you use kind of flower gardens, for example, they get
mm,
more sympathetic by just looking at it.
absolutely. You know, I think it's a lot easier to bring color into the public realm when it's through either the natural landscape, where color is kind of inherent to, you know, the plants and the flowers and the trees,
Mhm.
or if it's a piece of artwork. I think color is always allowed in artwork, but I think when it comes to architecture, it's a much harder sell. It's much more difficult to convince people that it's worth doing, or that it's um, not uncontroversial, but
Mhm.
appealing, I suppose.
If we're talking about colors, I'm not sure how it is in London. It has a little bit to do with navigation or orientation and color, but how is it in London? I can see in our cities here in Austria, that
Mm.
color on the street is very often used to differentiate between mobility groups, and there seems to be a trend. I don't know why that lately the pedestrian crossings are
Mm.
becoming colorful. For example, where I am from in Innsbruck, some of them are really colorful now and not in the standard black and white. Is that
Mm.
something that is happening in London as well?
Um, it does happen, and it happens occasionally, and it's always wonderful when it does. But it's always a kind of one-off artwork rather than a kind of citywide planned urban scheme.
Mhm. Um, when I look at you, I mean, there's so many interesting things on your website that you are presenting with regards to colors. But one interested me in particular, and that was the study that you made on color and dementia, and you
Hmm.
named it a day in the life study. Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give a bit of context about the project, I'm part of a team working on a large building for University College London. And it's going to house laboratories with scientists who are looking for treatments and ultimately cures for dementia and other neurodegenerative conditions. But also within the building is not just laboratories and scientists, but also patients. So there's going to be a small outpatient clinic. And therefore, we've had to think a lot about how you design spaces for people who might be neurologically or visually impaired. So, yeah, one of the things that I've been doing as part of this project is looking at how we might use color not only to improve people's ability to move around the space,
Hmm.
but also to improve well-being. Um, and I think that there is already some research on this, but I think it's very much um, people translate the guidance quite literally. And I think there's a real opportunity to think in a really fresh way about how we can use color to be in an appealing way, but also in a way that helps people with very specific requirements move around the space.
Can you tell us some of the results that kind of, you said it's in the early stages, it's not yet finished, but do you have some
Yes, that's
results?
correct. Um, there's some really interesting things that we found in the guidance that we've been collecting. So, um, for example, when as you get older, the lens of your eye starts to become yellow. It
Mhm,
starts to yellow over time. So what that means is, a 70-year-old, for example, might not be able to distinguish between colours that are quite close together as easily as someone who's young. Um, so what we've found out is that colours towards the red part of the spectrum are much easier for someone to tell the difference between. So someone looking at a red next to an orange will be able to see that the colours are different. Whereas if they look at a green and a blue next to each other, it's harder for them to tell the difference. So I think things like that are quite useful to bear in mind. That's not to say that you should design only with a red and orange colour palette, but I think it's just to be kind of aware of, yeah, I suppose kind of people's visual requirements.
mhm,
And then the other big thing is colour contrast. So every single colour on the colour spectrum has a light reflectance value. So pure perfect white is 100 and black is 0, and then every other color sits somewhere between 0 and 100. And to achieve adequate color contrast between two colors that are next to each other, you need to have a difference of 30. So that's also really useful to know if you are designing where the door handles go or where the fittings go on the toilets, so that someone can absolutely see them.
mhm. The when I look at the drawings that you have on your website, the little illustrations of these specific moments in the day of the life of an elderly person, uh,
Hmm.
you use a lot of colors in these kind of drawings. Are these actually, could these be real life situations? Like, I'm looking at the moment at the drawing where the elderly person in the wheelchair is sitting in front of the escalator. Is it
Hmm.
escalator? I
Hmm.
hope I have selected the correct word. Elevator or escalator
Yes,
or both?
elevator, both actually.
Elevator. It's, I think it's American and English. English. I think that's what the difference
Yeah,
is.
we call it a lift.
Yeah, thank you. The third one. So it's like, for example, there's a green door and there's a light orange wall. So you
Hmm.
have like a contrast between the two in light and dark, but as well in the general color. Is this like the situations that should be achieved?
It's a good question. The intention of those drawings is to put the idea into the client's head that this building will be colourful. It's not to say it will literally be these colours, but it's to kind of create an understanding that we think colour is something worth investigating and that
Hmm.
we want it to be considered. It's not just default going to be National Health Service white and blue branding. It's going to be more considered than that. So it's just to kind of set the scene, I suppose.
Hmm.
Um,
Because you use color. There's is another drawing, of a typical situation within a station, um,
mhm,
where you use color. What I found interesting, for example, you use the same color for the door than for the back wall in the room, which I
mhm,
find quite interesting for orientation purposes as well. Not only the differentiation between the wall and the door, but
mhm,
once you go into the room, you know you're in the correct room because it's the same color than the door. So that's and the doors along the way have different colors,
mhm.
which I found quite interesting as well, because usually they have the same color or
Yeah.
differentiate between internal and public doors, for example.
I think one of the purposes of the day in the life study was to think about a person's journey through the building. So, how often, what order of spaces they go through, how long they're in each of those spaces, and how they feel when they're there.
Hmm.
And the thing about what you typically get in clinical spaces is there's often a lot of repeating rooms, lots of doors along a corridor, and that can make people feel quite nervous. So I
Hmm.
think by breaking up the repetition using lots of different colors, that's one way of trying to overcome the nervousness. But then also, like you say, each room will have an individual personality, and it will kind of, the door is the entry point, and then you go in the room and it's its own space.
Hmm.
Another thing that we thought about is the fact that when you apply color to a space, it's never static. So, this a consultation room might be green, but in the morning it will be a very different green to the green that it is at 5 p.m. in the winter.
Because of the change of the natural light that is coming through the window.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we thought about things like, as the light comes in, what direction is it coming in, and is it going? What wall will that light then be reflected onto? Um, and I think things like that help people in a space feel like time is changing. It feels less static. It kind of brings nature into the room. And I think it's very important because often people kind of look at a color swatch, pick the color, and then think that's it. But it's
Hmm.
actually a spectrum that you're choosing rather than a static color.
Hmm. If we look at dementia, is there any other results that you have gotten so far from your study? How much
Um,
colors to use, which colors to use? Is there, or is it something else that might be very interesting?
it's a very good question. That's what we're currently trying to do. The benefit of working with UCL is that there are a lot of neuroscientists and neurologists who do clinical research with patients at different points along the dementia pathway. And we're hoping to work directly with patients
Hmm.
to understand their view of the world, and get a more kind of empathetic um, understanding of their experience.
Hmm.
But we're also looking at existing guidance. I think that there's nothing uh, prescriptive in terms of specific colors that you should use. It's
Hmm.
more about um, making things as clear as possible. So, for example, where you have one room going into another room, if the floor color changes, that might be perceived as a step. Or, if the light reflects onto the floor and the floor is shiny, that might be perceived as a hole in the floor or
Hmm.
some kind of obstruction. So there's a lot of guidance that kind of prescribes what kind of materials to use, but not specifically what kind of colors to use. So I think what we're interested in looking at is, I suppose, maybe the preferences of certain kinds of patient groups, or how maybe patients at different stages of their dementia pathway might perceive a space. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
I think that's because I read a couple of articles because of our work as well regarding dementia, and one thing that stayed in my mind was that you can use colors, for example, to differentiate spaces and to make it easier for some either in the early stages or in the later stages of dementia, to know he's in the right place,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
the specific moment, because one of the things that gets lost is that they can't remember. So they have to know in the moment that they're right on the correct place. And one of the things they were talking about in the studies is that the color itself may not be enough, but you could, as a additional support, to give like the written color as well. So if it's the red zone, it's called red zone, or
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
red lift, for example. Is this
Mm.
Did you look at this topic yet, or is this something that will play a role in your research on
It's a very
how?
interesting one, that, because I have seen spaces that do that, and I think there's a very fine line between making a space as readable and accessible as possible and making it feel institutional. And I think
Mhm,
what works better sometimes, rather than using text, particularly if maybe some people visiting the building might not speak English, is thinking about maybe kind of pictorial things or the use of
mhm,
artwork. So we've got an artist on board on the project who is kind of working with us on thinking about how we might use artwork for wayfinding as well. So it
mhm.
could be a destination point at the end of a corridor, and that kind of triggers a memory for someone who has kind of just arrived at the building. So you could use artwork to differentiate zones, or to I suppose kind of create clear destination points.
I think that's very valuable personal opinion on that, that to actually combine those two, to not only make a very positive place and livable place, but use everything for both goals to make it a very positive, comfortable place, and at the
Mm.
same time make give it like the function to know where you are, and that you're in the right place. I think art has this kind of power.
The other thing is that um, guidance and sort of design moves that you make to help people, or to make a building more accessible, benefit everyone. It's not just about the group that you're trying to understand. So in our case, it's not just about patients with dementia. It's also about the
Mhm.
staff that are there every day, the relatives of the patients, the cleaning staff, like people that use the building every day. If the building is accessible for someone with dementia, it's also successful for everyone else.
Have you, because as a service designer, I was really I liked your approach on going through the process of the people you're looking at and to find the solutions for. So you have different contact points. Did you, or have you already found some kind of which colors would fit specific contact points, like an information point, or well, between a room and an information point there probably is a difference, but
Mm.
is there kind of a difference of the colors you should use for specific contact points? Is there some kind of differentiation, or has it more to do with branding of the building and the general atmosphere you want to create?
um, It's a really good question. And you've hit on a really interesting point, in that, we are working within an institution who do have their own signage and their own branding, and we have to be kind of conscious of that and work together with it. Um, I think in terms of very specific colours to use, there's a lot of kind of interesting research about, how people respond to specific colours. Green makes me feel like this, and red makes me feel like this.
Hmm.
But I'm personally quite skeptical of that stuff, because I think colours really are always in context. They're never in isolation. Um, so I think what's more important is making sure that the palette you choose kind of works together, um, kind of all the colours work together well,
Hmm.
um, and making sure that it's accessible visually, so that you have adequate contrast. I think that's the most important thing, rather than the specific colours you choose.
Hmm. I think it's interesting to talk about function of colors. So differentiating between two different kinds of furniture, or giving atmosphere to the room. I think that's really an interesting blend, and
Hmm.
maybe increases the complexity as well when deciding about colors.
Yeah, I mean, we have. The way that we've done our initial colour studies is thinking about the local context. So, what we've done at the moment is the consultation rooms are split into 3 zones. The first one is next to this kind of sensory garden, so it responds to the specific plants that we have
Hmm.
in the garden outside the building. And then another one is in quite a dark part of the floor plan. So those colours are a lot more about kind of coziness and trying to embrace the fact that it's slightly darker.
Hmm.
And then on the eastern part of the building, that's where you get morning light coming in. So we've gone for quite kind of fresh colours that are very bright when the light's going to come, the natural daylight's going to come directly in. So that's what's informed our specific palette. But then also, we've got an artist who's looking at the local geology
Hmm.
of the area that the building's in to try and understand the soil samples that are there and kind of try and gather some interesting colour sources from there too.
Hmm. So you're always trying to connect the story of a location to the color palette. Or so let's say each location has a story to tell with colors as well, and you can use that and bring it in context to what you want to achieve regarding the kind of building you're going to build or the kind of
Yeah,
place you're going to create.
yeah, absolutely. And Bloomsbury, this specific part of London has these really, really beautiful kind of red brick terracotta buildings,
Hmm.
which we're also sort of drawing on as well.
Nice. Hey, that's we're coming to the end, unfortunately already.
It went really quickly.
I'd have a couple of other questions, but for today, it's just the final two. As usual, when have you laughed the last time full-heartedly,
Um,
and why?
Slightly strange one. I went to visit my parents the other week and I heard this loud bang because my mum dropped a really heavy book on the floor and she said, "Ow," really loudly. So I said, "Are you okay? If you dropped a book on your foot?" And she went, "No." And I said, "Why did you say ow?" And she said, "Oh, I was worried about all the characters."
Oh, if it wouldn't be a real story, I would say that's a really good joke, actually. This can be, that's how jokes are created, actually.
No, I know. She always surprises me
It's a
like
good,
that.
it's a good one.
It is.
I like it. And the second one would be it's a more conventional one. It's the
Hmm.
reading tip for the listeners. What would you recommend?
Does it have to be about architecture?
No, it can, whatever you want others to read. Can be
Um,
everything.
I'm reading a really wonderful book at the moment called This Is an Uprising.
Yes.
It's by Marc and Paul Engler, and it's about non-violent political protest and how, when they often look quite spontaneous and like they're a response to something that's happened really recently, they're often very, very kind of carefully crafted and thought about.
Hmm.
And it kind of charts lots of the kind of really interesting recent political movements like Black Lives Matter, things like that, and kind of looking forensically at how they developed and what we can learn from them.
Hmm.
And I think political protest is something that requires a lot of creativity, and it's something that I'm really interested in learning more about, and it's a wonderful book.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Um, if possible, could you send me a link to this book?
Yeah,
Because this is a good point to mention that we will put all the information in the show notes as well, not only this book link, but as well the website of Helena and the website of Hawkins Brown. Plus, I'd have one, if I can have one wish, would you have one or two studies that you find interesting regarding your work with color that we could share the link in the show notes? Would that be possible to send me that?
yeah, absolutely.
That would be great, just to connect to the broader spectrum of your study. And otherwise, I'm forced to say thank you, Helena, for the time you've given us. I'm not forced to tell you. I'm not forced to say it, of course, but the time is over. I really would have liked to talk a little bit more about colors. But I'd say thank you very much for this conversation and for the interesting for your interesting work. I'm looking forward to more results. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.